Good afternoon, all, and welcome to the Charleston Literary Festival and this exploration into a subject area that most of us believe we know more about than we actually do. And that is reading. We're all here in part because we're all readers, I assume. But what does it actually mean? My name is Victor Young, and I'm happy to serve as one of the festival board members. I'm an educator who has spent most of my career, long career, working all over this country trying to help school districts, philanthropies, governments find more effective ways of improving schooling and the life chances of many underserved people. Always attempting to address the question, how do we create a more equitable, just society going forward? And I want to, at this point, to just thank our donor and supporter of this session for caring enough to support our doing this, the Jim Pallotta and the Pallotta Family Foundation. This is such an important topic. So it took me only about 3 decades, I'm smart like that, working with schools and communities all over the place and studying our individual human journeys from cradle forward to realize that all of this development, all of the things that we say we want as a civil society always circled back to reading. Reading somehow was at the crux of it all. But why, and what exactly does that mean? Tony Scott's New York Times essay brilliantly, and I say that because this is how it hit me when I walked through it, it brilliantly takes the reader on a journey that explores the what's and the whys of reading in the context of human history and our social evolution, and taking the holistic approach to its challenges, many of our assumptions and definitions about that thing reading that we think we all know a lot about. So, Tony Scott, and I keep on, I have to apologize here. I keep wanting to call him A.O.Scott, which is how I always read his name, but he corrected me. Tony Scott spent 23 years as a film critic for the New York Times prior to becoming the, I believe, critic at large for the New York Times Book Review. He is joined today by our vice chair and the Charleston Literary Festival vice chair, Wenda Harris Millard, who has spent decades, she said 45, but I don't think she's old enough to have done 45. So she stretched it, but over 40 years at the highest levels of publishing in this country, both in print media and digital. So I think we're about to witness and have a wonderful conversation about reading, about what we are talking about when we talk about reading, how it affects the development of us as individuals and civil society. So with that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Vic, and thank all of you for joining us today. I would highly doubt that this subject is not of real concern, of primary import to everyone in this audience. So I am really, really looking forward to talking with you, Tony, about this very important subject. And let me just say that the essay that Vic just referred to was written in June of this year, 2023, in the New York Times. And the title was "Everybody Likes Reading. Why Are We So Afraid of It?" So, Tony, why don't you spend a few minutes talking about, what inspired you to write this, You are, of course, known as one of the most preeminent movie critics of our time. Yes, you are.
Well,
And
I used to be.
but but this is a little bit of a departure
Yeah.
for you. So if we could just sort of level set, if you
Sure.
could chat for a bit about how this came about.
I mean, some of it, I think Victor just put it really well, that this is something that we think we know about. You know, I've been reading all my life. I was a literary critic. I'm a writer. I know what reading is, and I understand, you know, why it's important and valuable, and what it has meant to me. But as I was making the transition from being a film critic to being a book critic, which is something that happened, you know, after 23 years of spending most of my daylight hours in the dark, looking at movies and doing something that you know, people generally do for fun and distraction as my very serious work, I was ready to go back to literary criticism, which is where I'd started out, and I thought it would be interesting to take a wide view of this field that I was going back into. And one of the things that as a movie critic I'd started really to think about and to be curious about and to feel that critics and people who write about movies should be spending more time thinking about was not so much film or cinema or the art form, but the activity by which people consume it. And I had been thinking a lot about movie going, about streaming and going to theaters, and especially during COVID, about the change and what it meant, you know, for the movies and for the culture that people were shifting away from buying tickets and going to theaters to watching everything on their phones or in their homes. And I thought, well, maybe there's something to be done, not necessarily about literature, about the state of writing, which is a kind of a vast and overwhelming topic and would have taken me, you know, 15 or 20 years to prepare or to catch up with, but about reading. And about this time I started to notice, you know, as you sometimes do, you see different stories in the media and different things that are going on, apparently in different parts of the culture, of the society, that seemed to be circling around a common theme. So I started noticing, I think one of the first things I saw was an article in the New Yorker about how college students weren't majoring in English anymore, and nobody is reading the great books anymore, and students, young people who tend to be the most reliable and passionate readers, and who kind of keep the literary culture going forward, were abandoning. We're interested in other things. And then around the same time, there started to be these efforts to take books out of classrooms, to control what was in school libraries, to a lot of worry and conflict about what children were reading. And also a parallel set of conflicts about how children were learning how to read. There was a very interesting and very influential podcast called Sold a Story, which was about how some of the models of teaching reading to the youngest children weren't working, and that children's ability to read and process information was suffering. And there was a sort of a big argument in the educational world, again, it had gone on before, about phonics versus whole language. So all of these things were happening, and there was a lot being written about AI and about how certain of the functions of writers especially, but also of readers, were being taken over.
We're going to get into AI pretty deeply
That's the
as
big
we
one.
move
So
along here.
to make the long, this was just sort of my wandering thought process. And one thing that I like to do just as a writer is to start out with a problem or a question that I have no idea how to address. To be really just at the very limit of my expertise, of my skill, of my knowledge, so that I can start, as I think about it, can kind of develop a sort of a route through it. So it wasn't as if felt like I was coming in as a great expert on all things related to reading and explaining what was happening in all of these things, but I was just kind of looking around and saying, well, what's going on? What is it? Why is reading such a hot button, such a hot topic, such a kind of a nexus of all of this struggle and anxiety and worry? And why do we value it the way we do, or why, on the other hand, do we say that we value it the way we do as a society, and then also in various ways undermine it, try to prevent people from reading? Or
the title of the piece says, everybody likes reading. Why are we so afraid of it?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by being afraid of it?
Well, I think that you see that with the efforts to ban and control books. Everyone thinks, well, it's very important for children to read, but they shouldn't read the wrong things, or they shouldn't read certain words. So there are efforts to clean up the offensive or troubling language of certain writers. There was a big kind of to-do about Dr. Seuss, another one about Roald Dahl, about
all our heroes.
All our heroes. And I think that this is something that happens, there are versions of it that happen on the left and on the right, where it's like, well, we don't want children to read things that will upset them or confuse them or provoke them or give them the wrong ideas. And
they shouldn't be watching the news either.
But they shouldn't be reading any, because everything that I just said is just what reading is. I mean, if that is, it seemed to me that what really happens to you when you read is that your certainties are troubled, that you are sometimes disturbed or confused or upset or offended, or you need something explained to you. Or there seemed to be this kind of idea that you could simultaneously teach children to read and encourage them, to kind of open up their minds and their imaginations, which is what reading, of course, does, and why we all believe in it and cherish it. But at the same time, control it and protect it and manage it. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting, there's an interesting tension here, and it's a tension here that isn't only related to reading, but that kind of goes to a lot about how we think about our society and our civic culture, which is that we want, people to be, and everything to be free and open and accessible, but we're also terrified of what would happen if that was really true.
I want to read a little piece from the essay that is very relevant to this. So the notion that education, reading, writing, arithmetic would cause discontent among lower classes has been prevalent throughout history. And Frederick Douglass said that learning to read tormented and stung his soul to unutterable anguish. And he said learning to read sometimes felt like more of a curse than a blessing. And you note that reading liberates and torments us, makes and unmakes our social and solitary selves. Every reader has experienced something like Douglass's liberating epiphany, and also something like his annihilating agony. Is this part of why you say we're afraid of it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's this as I was kind of doing the research, I was looking into the history of reading, and it's certainly true that the idea that reading, that literacy is a universal good that should belong to everyone, is not an idea that has always been
talk a little
popular.
bit about that,
well,
because I think you kind of started with when the Gutenberg press came to be. That's when reading became available to people outside of the upper classes. I mean,
it is a really fascinating history, and of how first how alphabets developed in the ancient world, and not everywhere, but also independently. So in Central America, in Mesopotamia, in China, in the Andes, in Egypt, there were different writing systems and different reading systems, and Some were ideograms, some were phonetic, some were alphabets. But in general, from very early on, the people in power understood that reading was a powerful and also threatening thing, and it needed to be limited. So there were only certain classes of people. There were priests, or there were scribes, or in the Roman Empire,
aristocrats,
or
right.
aristocrats, or people whose jobs was just to read to aristocrats. So in ancient Rome, many of the aristocrats themselves couldn't read, but they were special classes of servants and enslaved people whose jobs were to read. So the idea of this being available to everybody on a sort of mass level was something that not only wasn't easily imaginable in terms of the technologies of reading and writing as they developed, but also was seen to be a threat. And I think that is an idea that kind of the seed of that idea gets planted very early and then develops over time and stays really central to the idea of reading up until just a few hundred years ago. The idea that this is something that's so dangerous in a way, right? It has such a power to alter people's understandings of their own lives and their own conditions, and to give them a kind of critical insight into how things are that may lead them to think about changing how things are, that we better keep it away from them. And this was, I would say, was nowhere more systematically practiced maybe than in the American South during the time of slavery, where there were laws on the books in just about every state against teaching enslaved Africans to read. And this is what Douglass was talking about.
And I think that Douglass is such a perfect example of this. I was thinking when I was reading it, that should have been the agony and the ecstasy.
Well, right. I mean, it's an extraordinary passage in the narrative life of the Frederick Douglass, where he talks about how his master in Maryland, was adamant that he would not, learn to read, and he was taught to read first by, I think, the master's daughter, and then there's a wonderful passage of how, as a boy, Frederick would kind of bribe the white children coming home from school. He would sort of give them candy or snacks, and they would teach him, what they had learned to read. But what he talks about, the passage that you quote, that is just one of the most extraordinary and kind of wrenching and moving passages in I think in 19th century American literature or any literature, is about reading this book called The Columbian Orator, which is an anthology of just kind of approved writing. It's about it's about the founding fathers and the Roman emperors, and about liberty and all of sort of the stuff that in 19th century America was part of the civic religion, at least for white people and for the ruling classes. And he found himself reading some of the text in there when he learned how to read them, and what he describes is just being undone by it, because the recognition of his own condition, of the terribleness of his own enslavement, hadn't occurred to him in a way until then. He hadn't felt it. He hadn't felt the gap between who he was as a person, as a thinking, intelligent, wondering, questioning person, and who he was defined as in the society so acutely and so terribly. And so he talks about how it threw him into despair. And he says, well, my master was right. That learning to read would create a kind of discontent and led him, ultimately to be one of the main figures in the abolition of slavery. So, I don't want to, obviously this is an extraordinary and dramatic, this is an extraordinary person, this is a very particular historical circumstance, but there is something in that passage where he talks about being at once kind of his world being opened up and being liberated and feeling a kind of anguish and confusion and despair coming as the sort of the recoil of that. That seemed to me central of what, when we're talking about reading, that's the power that it has.
Yeah, for sure. One of the other things that you said in the piece is that I guess it goes back a little bit to children, our efforts to cocoon children and keep them away from certain books. Your point of view in the piece was that this will always fail, which I found one of the most optimistic things that you said in the piece. But can you talk a little bit more about why that effort will fail?
Yeah, I think it's partly because, and I think one of the reasons that parents have a kind of anxiety about what their children read is well intentioned, is a desire for your children not to be upset. We don't like it. I mean, I'm a parent, and you don't like it when your children are upset or disturbed or scared or confused, and you want to fix that. And you also want to sort of control their environment and the stimuli that come into it. The thing about reading is that it's an entirely private act. That what is happening, because it happens within the consciousness of somebody, and it happens in this kind of extraordinary interaction between the consciousness or voice or the trace of the writer's consciousness that exists on the page and the reader's consciousness. And you can't get in there. You can't get inside anyone else's version of that. So you may be able to control what your child reads. We may be able to iron out every single objectionable word in every single book, in every single school library. But what happens, the connection that happens between the written language and the reader's consciousness, and the fact that I think that the reader's mind will seek out and find all kinds of sensations that can't be controlled. I just think of myself as a young reader. The things that used to scare me or upset me or give me nightmares were the things that nobody could have guessed would have. We're not actually like the scary things. And the words that children might find kind of titillating or that sort of might awaken some kind of sexual curiosity, which is the other thing we're very afraid of. You don't know what those words are going to be. Those might not be the obvious words. Right. It might not be the obvious scenes. It might be something, if you think about your own growing up, the development of your own consciousness. It's very weird what happens inside somebody's mind. And reading, I think, maybe even more than television and movies and the sort of the visual stimuli that we're also always very worried about. Reading, because we can't see it too, in a way, and you can't experience it the way that they do. And so that's why I think that the power of the reader's curiosity, in a way, will even project onto the texts exactly some of those feelings and responses and questions that we're trying to control when we're trying to control what text they're reading.
So the book bans that are going on all over the country, and some of the reaction to the book bans, like just free books at the library and all that.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about what you think will happen with this book banning? Are we just at a point in time where this is happening and then that'll go away and be replaced by something else? Or is book banning here to stay, given how politicized it's become?
We are. It's a hard question, and it's hard to predict, because we have been one of the things that I also discovered, kind of doing some of the research and trying to figure out what it was that what this phenomenon was, if it even existed, that I was writing about, is that there's nothing new under the sun. That the effort to ban books is as old as books themselves, and in particular the effort in the United States to ban books in schools and in public libraries is something that we go through cycles of. But we do seem to be in a moment where what is called the culture wars is particularly dug in, and we keep seeming to find new things to fight about and new arenas for fighting, and the fight doesn't seem to stop. And I think that there are people who derive a lot of political advantage from these fights. So I don't know. I don't feel particularly optimistic now. I mean, my temperament is always optimistic. Is always kind of to believe that the side, which I don't think is a political or ideological side, but the side of curiosity and imagination and open-mindedness and free thought will at least not lose if it doesn't ever fully win.
The writing on this piece, I hope you do go back and look at it, but Tony's writing it's a little bit scary to read sometimes, but it's wonderful. And you write that bubbling underneath the bland and upbeat consensus that nobody is against reading, and we should all do a lot of it, there is a simmer of individual anxiety and collective panic. We are in the throes of a reading crisis. And you go on to say that the bad news is hardly new news, that tyrants, Philistines, religious zealots, and hysterical parents have been banning books for as long as anyone can remember. So, my question to you is, why does this time feel different? And is the root cause of that anxiety and panic that you refer to, is it markedly different from another time in history?
Well, I think what it is that, in some ways it's a version of the same old. I feel like a lot of the sort of the struggles or crises or impasses that we're in, culturally, socially, politically, are versions of what's come before. But that doesn't mean that they're always exactly the same. So that there have been fights about phonics and English instruction before. There have been efforts to ban books before. There's certainly been anxiety about children and technology as relates to reading before. That it was television, and now it's TikTok.
One of the funniest things that Adam Gopnik was talking about last night, for those of you who were here, every time we have a new medium, we think, oh, it's going to, replace, television is going to replace radio, and cable TV going vertical is going to replace, reading, and, it never does. So Adam Gopnik was saying last night, one of his aha moments on a subject like this was yelling into the other room to his son, will you turn off that computer and come watch television with me? And I thought that was just sort of a perfect, no medium does replace another medium.
Right, they just all kind of proliferate and bleed into each other.
And they learn, right.
And you certainly could make the case that there's more, as people have shifted, as let's say media has shifted from television to computer, that there's more reading and writing than there was. Certainly, everyone is reading and writing all the time when they're texting, and there are new, there's a whole new hieroglyphic alphabet of emojis that has emerged. That's a form of text-based communication. So I think, and that's an interesting kind of wrinkle in things. one thing that I do feel like is different, and this is something that I've thought about more since I wrote the piece, that I wasn't necessarily all the way there with when I was writing it, is that one thing that's very different now is the kind of the totalizing digital world that we live in. And I think that this affects, I started to think about this when I was writing kind of a more recent piece about movies and the state of moviegoing and what streaming had done to moviegoing. And one of the things that has increasingly disturbed me and that I've thought really marks a point of change rather than of just sort of cyclical repetition is the way that our activities when we're online are watched. That is, when you're reading a book, what I was talking about before is
it's such a personal and private.
Is this very intimate, very private, really impenetrable. Nobody knows what's happening, you know. Whereas the computer, if you're reading on the computer, the computer knows. I can, you know, write an article. When I used to write an article and it was in the printed newspaper, sometimes I would, you know, be riding the subway and I would see someone open to the page reading my thing, and that was like thrilling and unusual, and felt almost indecent that I was sort of like peeking in on someone who was peeking in on me. But now, you know, the data is all there. So and not only the data of how many readers a given thing has had, but how much of it they have read, how much time they spent with it, what the completion rate is. This can be exhilarating and also devastating news for writers. It's like, well, you know, 15,000 people read this article, only 800 of them finished it. But so, you know, that's imagine an, you know, an author of books having that, you know, well, you sold this many copies, and but only, you know, nobody got paid past page 12. So, but you know, every article on the Times homepage now has a little bug on it that says how long it will take you to read this. This is a 5-minute read. This is a 7-minute read. This is an 8-minute read. So you're being, in a way, kind of watched as you're reading, and what the digital text and the digital culture, the digital means of distributing these things to you is doing is collecting data from you. That's what's happening when you're watching Netflix. That's what's happening when you're reading online. And this troubles me. I'm not going to sit here and be kind of alarmist and apocalyptic about the consequences of this, but this is something new and troubling in the world of reading, and I think we're just at the beginning of finding out how it affects what is written, what is thought, what is said, what kind of culture it creates around itself that may displace or I think will certainly marginalize the world of reading that we've understood through the centuries of print.
Well, I think, you know, the privacy issue is a very, very serious issue. It's a 27-year-old issue now in the world of the digital space. And I don't think, you know, even I was at the beginning of the digital revolution, and at the time working for a company called DoubleClick, which was one of the first in the industry. Very sophisticated technology. We collected a lot of data, and it was a very, very scary time when people realized what that data could be used for. There are always, however, two sides to the coin. The data that you're talking about now on sort of these very, you know, small pieces of information that have powerful consequences. They can be used for the good in many, many ways, but I think one of the things that I want to quote you again, because I did love this writing. And actually, my question here that I was leading into is, how much does technology have to do with our current reading crisis? And again, you said, look, this is not new. Radio's been disruptive, TV, but you say now our attention spans have been chopped up and commodified, sold off piecemeal to platforms and algorithms. We're too busy, too lazy, too preoccupied to lose ourselves in books. So, I'll go back to that other question. Is the current technology scene, is it really worse than the historical distractions?
I think in some ways, because of the demands because one of the commodities now is, the principal commodity is attention, and the other one is time. And the digital platforms are quite overt about this. I mean, the head of Netflix has famously said that Netflix rivals are not other streaming companies but sleep. So, which is to say,
it's really true.
But it's true. It's like the idea, the desired kind of market position is a monopoly on your waking consciousness.
Well, I'm sure you read that book, The Attention Economy.
Right.
I mean, it's a very serious issue.
Yeah, it's a serious issue, and if also at the same time, a similar kind of surveillance is happening when we're at work, whether we're in the office or not. That the screens can monitor, what you're doing on them. So you used to be able to, if you used to be able to like sit at your company screen and like sneak off and read an article in the New York Times, on company times. Well, now
they know you're doing it.
They know.
But that was interesting during the pandemic. This got even more sophisticated, and the intrusion was even more pervasive. I remember reading an article in the New York Times about people looking at productivity and were they at their desk, and they knew absolutely every minute of the day what someone was doing. And it was a brilliant piece and led to a lot of interesting discussion about that. But I love the fact that you say reading is such a private thing, because all things online, all things internet are exactly the opposite.
Right.
There is no privacy at all.
And also, reading is, or can be, or maybe should be, fundamentally unproductive. The time that you are reading is in a way, it's yours in a way that the sort of the consciousness of reading is yours, and it's a way of kind of using the one of the most wonderful and strange gifts that we have as a species, which is the surplus of consciousness that we have, which is just this kind of imaginative. Like we have so much. Our brains are just working all the time and thinking all the time and making up stuff all the time. And reading is a beautiful channel for that, a beautiful way to just kind of really cultivate that garden and stay in that strange space. But it doesn't, I mean, in a strictly utilitarian accounting of, what we're supposed to be doing and what's worthwhile and what's productive and what's good for us, it doesn't really figure. So our much as we may say that we value it as a society, we organize our society in such a way as to narrow the space for it and kind of suppress and marginalize it as much as we can, which is why, just to say, an event like this one is a very good, I think, kind of antidote to that, or it's sort of a way of reclaiming some of that time, some of that space, some of that imagination from a world that's kind of organized to push it away.
Another point on that is that we now have the ability through technology to measure almost everything you can imagine.
Right.
And I think one of the questions is, should everything be measurable? And one of the things I remember out in Silicon Valley, I I spent a lot of time there. And what I remember is there were no museums. There was one computer museum, but no art museum. And people out in the valley, generalization, but I think it's pretty true, they didn't want to go to art museums because they couldn't understand, well, why is that beautiful? How do you know that's beautiful?
Right.
And it's really quite, and I think that sort of reading allows us not to have to measure everything. We can escape, and I think that's good for us. But one of the things that you also say in the piece is that you think that this reading crisis reflects a deep ambivalence about reading itself. Do you still agree with yourself as that was written not quite 6 months ago?
Yes,
do you think we are ambivalent as a society about reading?
I think that we are, and I think we are often as individuals. I think there's one of the things that you quoted a bit of is that, you know, each of us has a reading crisis that lives in us, where we're thinking about, you know, we're embarrassed about what we haven't read, or we think, you know, we're reading the wrong thing, or, you know, oh, I should be reading. I mean, this happens. I think this happens to me every time I'm reading a book. I think about all of the books that I should be reading, that are not that, you know, that or rereading. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of embarrassment, and I think there also is ambivalence in precisely this idea that, on the one hand, it's good for you. Reading is good for us. Kids should learn it. On the other hand, one of the great things about it is that it's not. Is that it's a waste of time. It's fun. It's non-productive. It's, you know, you can read the wrong things. You can read just, you know, just for the hell of it. And you can also read, I should say, you know, you can also read things that are dangerous and poisonous and toxic and false, and there's a lot of worry about that kind of reading. So I think that the ambivalence is exactly there. And there are two things that I analogize it to. And one of the things that I'm kind of proudest of in this piece is this little throwaway sentence, in a way, that took most of the thinking in the piece, which is that reading is like sexual desire and political democracy, and that these are these things that we hope can be channeled and regulated and controlled and done in, you know, responsible and healthy and benevolent ways that always find a way of kind of messing with that, of undermining, that have a kind of a power to subvert our attempts to control and to regulate them, including like in schools. Well, we're going to teach kids to read, and we're going to teach kids how to read, you know, the right books and the good books, and but the bad books are still going to be there, and everyone's going to want to read, you know, the good bad books and the bad books.
Exactly.
And there's no kind of perfecting or controlling or just sort of smoothing that out. And that actually makes me very hopeful. But that is, I think, what I meant by the ambivalence is that we, you know, we'd like it if it were all a certain way, but it's never going to be that way.
Well, I think that is a great lead into a bit of a discussion about AI,
Yeah.
which you call the dark enchantment, which I love. But again, two sides of the coin always. But could you share a little bit of your thinking about how AI will affect both writing and
Yeah.
reading? I mean, I think, look, we've just come off this writer's strike in Hollywood, and I think that also opened the door for a lot of AI activity and a lot of questions about how AI will affect writing and maybe reading going forward.
I mean, I think there's certainly been a lot of thought about writing, and I mean, I think some of the first alarms were raised among English teachers who thought, you know, well, it was bad enough when students could buy term papers on the internet, but that was traceable. But if and it's also this sort of the English teacher trick of coming up with a prompt that would elude that doesn't work, because you can put that into the chatbot and say, whatever the crazy assignment your professor gave you, it can write that. So I think a lot of the anxiety has to do with the production of content, and just even the fact that word, content is the word instead of writing, tells you something. But that journalists, ad copywriters, screenwriters, there is this idea that you could that a lot of that work could be displaced onto AI. Now,
could AI replace critics?
Well, that question goes right. That depends on what you think criticism is and what you think criticism is for. Because AI is actually very good at recommendation, and that is to say, and this is true. I mean, we all use the algorithms. If you use Spotify or Apple Music, based on what you like, what you listen to, it will find things. And
recommendation engines.
The recommendation engines, and they're quite sophisticated, and they're quite. I use it all the time. I mean, I'll start listening to one playlist, and then just the algorithm will keep going, and I'll often find music that, oh yeah, you did know something about my taste. How did you know that? But the way AI works, of course, is that it just, through recombining everything that's already out there in the digital world, on the internet, and using very rapid calculations of probability to figure out what the most likely thing is next. So that's how it writes. It's sort of.
So you say AI really can't create something because it has to search for what exists.
And it has to search for what exists, but also I think the more important thing about criticism is that, and this is my own bias, my own sense of what criticism is that criticism is grounded in experience. That is, when I write a review of a movie, when I used to do that, I had seen the movie. I had sat there and either suffered through it or enjoyed it, laughed, cried, whatever. And AI does not have that experience, and criticism is the way that we communicate that experience with each other, so that I, as somebody who has seen the movie, am communicating with you as someone who might also have that experience to tell you something about what that experience was. And just the very fact that AI exists as a sort of disembodied computing function means that it does not have that kind of subjectivity. So the thing that I've said, that the analogy that I use, or the metaphor, is that many times when I was a movie critic and I would sit in the movies, my foot would fall asleep. And sometimes not just your foot, sometimes your whole leg falls asleep. You've probably had this experience, and you have to watch the movie while you're kind of trying to wake it up. And that you don't write. I've never written about that in a movie review, because who cares? But the point is that's part of what went into that is part of what actually happened to me when I was watching that movie, and that is where my criticism comes from. The same body whose lower leg was completely numb while they were.
So you didn't just say, "Alexa, wake up my foot."
No.
So I think we should probably switch to your questions now. I could talk about this all day, all night, but we can't. We have definitely time for questions, and there's one right there. So I guess Sarah's got the mic.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm wondering how you feel about the influence of media, of television theater even on anti-intellectualism in the United States. You know, the portrayal of the mad scientist as a stereotype of an Einstein, the portrayal of a librarian as you know, the portrayal of an engineer as a nerd with the slide rule.
Well, how about the portrayal of critics? I mean, that's you know.
Well, you can respond to that.
But yeah, I mean, I think that there is this is I think related in a way to Wenda's question about the ambivalence about reading, is that, you know, on the one hand, as a society, we value learning and accomplishment and expertise in science, and we also hate it and hate the people who embody it. And there's a deep current of anti-intellectualism in American culture, even as there's also a rather extraordinary history of intellectual accomplishment and of democratic intellectual accomplishment. I mean, I think in some ways with movies in particular, there's a strong current throughout Hollywood history of a kind of populism, that is to say, of movie populism in the sense of, like, well, we want to make movies for everybody, and we want, you know, to sort of imagine a kind of a middle denominator at which so everything that's you know too high or too low is subject to kind of to ridicule or mockery or caricature.
So I think, Sarah, we have a question here and also in the front.
Thank you. With a pullback from liberal arts and it seems the lack of discernment in terms of what one is reading, what people are led to believe by yellow journalism or fake news or whatever you want to call it, I find it distressing, and I wonder what you have to say about that in terms of the quality of education for our children and where this may lead, because I find it quite frightening.
I mean, I do. I'm someone who, you know, before I got into journalism, I was in academia, and I've had many friends and family who've spent their lives doing that. And I would say that the abandonment of the liberal arts and of the humanities in universities, in particular, you know, in public colleges and universities. I mean, you know, as recently, I think at the University of Virginia, West Virginia University, the shutting down of whole departments. So apparently nobody needs to learn French or foreign languages. And I think that it is part of this of an idea of a kind of a narrowly utilitarian idea that everything that people need to learn needs to be in some way, in some demonstrable, kind of measurable way, useful. And I think that the imposition of a lot of quantification, of sort of metrics and data, whether it's tests or whether it's, you know, the number of majors in a given field, you know, that will have to that will determine the budgeting of that department, means that the department will try to get as many majors as they can, and therefore kind of, you know, pander to what it thinks the kids are going to be interested in. So that the idea of a cultural space that might exist outside of the marketplace or outside of that sort of quantified realm is something that I think has really eroded in an alarming way. And I don't know, you know, what the answer is, because it seems to me that the idea that some things might have value for their own sake, even if they're not particularly popular or particularly useful, even if, so if somebody somewhere is learning ancient Greek, maybe it would be good for us as a society to keep that possible. And I think that there are still people who believe in that, and I think there are still people who give lip service to it. But I do think that the kind of the imperatives of commerce and of quantification are so strong and so powerful, and have gotten into parts of the society, including in the educational sphere, that had been, for various very complicated historical reasons that we don't have time to go into, and I couldn't even elaborate on, had been sort of protected, aren't protected anymore.
Mr. Scott, thank you for coming to Charleston and sharing your thoughts with us this weekend and having Wenda here to help us. I'd like to hear some of your thinking on the banning of books that we see so much of now.
Yeah.
I come from a position that I'm pretty progressive about that. I think I see it as book banning and book burning, and have generally relegated those who supported it as being politically driven and from places that I'm not comfortable with. But then this week I read a very insightful piece in the New York Times, or Atlantic, I'm getting confused which it was, that focused on a lady in Virginia who is one of 11 in the country who's responsible for 80 and 90% of the books that have been banned in the last couple of years. And that was a real eye-opener for me. But then this piece started giving you examples of what they were pointing out in much of this literature, and it opened my eyes. It was so sexually explicit, and in some instances, perverted in ways that caused me to stop and say, well, there's more here than I thought, that I need to think more. But then I realized that it quickly drifts into opposition to gay marriage and in opposition to a lot of LGBT things. And that gets sort of confusing for all our politics in some respects.
Yeah.
But I'd kind of like to hear your thinking on it, because it has sort of woke me up. Because what I read, I don't want my children and grandchildren, when they're in grammar school or preteen, necessarily being exposed to that.
Well, I mean, I think I know the article that you're talking about, and I was fascinated by it, because I did think it was an interesting kind of and more detailed sort of look at what's going on, and I think of the thinking behind the book banning. But one of the things that I took away from it, which is a little different, is that the woman in the story spends an awful lot of time reading and seems particularly devoted to reading as much sexually explicit material as she can with an idea. No, I mean, with an idea of thinking about how children would be reading it. And I think that there is a sort of an interesting kind of literary devotion that she has almost to it, and I think that I think it's a complicated question, and it's a question that I always feel like is best left really out of the political and out of the public sphere, and that I think also that children will discover. Children, first of all, are I think smarter than we often give them credit for, more curious than we would perhaps like them to be, but I think that the danger of this material is often overstated, and often has more to do with our own discomfort at thinking about our children and the world that they live in, and about especially their sexuality and their relation to their own bodies and their own kind of sexual feelings. that it has more to do with adult anxieties and phobias than with perhaps an actual danger to
I
to
hate
children.
to end this, and I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, but Tony will be here signing books, and I know there's a lot more to talk about, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Wenda. Thank you all. Thank you.
Wow, just a couple of housekeeping things before everybody runs away. Uh, First of all, I did want to also, again, just thank both of you for doing a brilliant job of taking us through sort of this thought journey about reading and forcing us to think about its relationship to us as human beings. So thank you again. I want to thank you for that. And again, I wanted to thank the Pallotta Family Foundation for making this possible, because that's why we're able to do this. And just for anyone who's interested, this week there will be a festival session that focuses on sort of the challenges and benefits, risk and benefits of AI with a panel of experts from publishing, and that will be Thursday, for anyone interested, 6 p.m. at Dock Street Theater. Thursday, 6 p.m., Dock Street Theater. And finally, there'll be, as you already know, a book signing. Thank you all for being here.